Good morning. I haven't met you before. I'm Peter, and I'm a member here. If you're a guest with us this morning, we're delighted to have you with us. I'm a little bit frazzled this morning because I'm trying to make sense of some things that have happened along the way this morning. First of all, our printer gave up the ghost, more or less. Actually, the ghost is still there. It's just now haunting us. And so we ended up having to not only wrestle with that, but also get things printed out for this morning for the kids, as well as for a couple of other things. We went to FedEx. FedEx was closed. We went to Office Depot. I got there and my laptop charger was not in my bag. We managed to get things printed out still and managed to get here. I just checked in my bag and my Bible was not there, so I will be using the digital version this morning. I'm trying to make sense of things. And I'm doing that by telling you a story. And at this point, really, it's more like a series of events that happened, and I can only tell you this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. Now come back to me in a few days, and I might be able to tell you a thorough line that goes through it. I might be able to even pick out details that I'm remembering, or perhaps embellishing, that actually draw you better into the story. And by the end of it, you might even say that there was actually a story arc, instead of just that Peter should have printed things the day before. Stories are how we make sense of things. That's what helps life, but that's really what lets us live life as more than just a series of this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. Stories give shape to our lives. And by not only telling our stories do we make our meaning out of life, but we then have a way to interpret the things that happen after that. We have in this church been going through a series of what I would call practices, a series of things that we do in church that are basic, yes, but they are basic in the same way that that eating and breathing and knowing other people are basic. These are things that are, yes, back to basics, but they are fundamental for us. These are things that we do on a regular basis, things like gathering, things like singing, things like prayer, things like baptism that initiate us into the life of not only the church, but really into God's life as well. This morning, I want to talk about stories. I want to talk about not only the stories that we tell, but the stories that we live. As I just mentioned, stories are important for us. They give our life meaning. From the time that we are smallest, stories are how we make sense of the world. Part of the reason that my son, who's coming up on 4 years old, asks for stories, not just at bedtime, but if I tell him about why something is, to the best of my ability, there are many questions like that, he will sometimes ask, can you tell me the story again? Stories are how he makes sense of the world, and that's how it is for us from the youngest of our ages. When we go into the Bible, the first thing that we find on the very first pages of our Bible, at least for most people's Bibles, you open up, and it starts not, I guess I should say, with saying God is omniscient, God is omnipotent. It does not start with propositional sayings or things that appeal to your logic. Instead, it starts with a story. And yes, there is logic to it, but the way in which we learn about God from the Bible is not through statements, but through stories. And this is the case if you open up into the book of Genesis, which is the very first in most Bibles. Even if you pick up a Bible that is only the New Testament and you look at and you open it up, it starts with stories. about Jesus. And even within the Bible itself, stories have a magnitude of power far beyond most other things. So again, you open it up, and the first 5 books of the Bible are basically story. Even when you get to the law parts, and when most people's Bible plans that they start in January and by February they're wrecked because they get to Leviticus, even there, these are part of the overall story of God bringing Israel from not just from one place to another, but bringing Israel more and more into God's own life. When you get to the Psalms, and it's all poetry, and you're like me, you start reading one psalm, and after about 5, they all start to sound similar. You get to some psalms that reference the story of the people of Israel, and that's how the psalm makes sense. And of course, you get to the New Testament, and you get to what I saw one time, the title of an introduction to the New Testament, titled as The Story Retold. Jesus is doing something new. God is doing something new that we see in the New Testament, but it is in line with the rest of the story. Stories are how not only we make sense as people, it's how we make sense of life as Christians. And the ways in which we live out our stories has implications for what we do on a daily basis, as well as what we do when we come together. I need to apologize just briefly for mentioning in the text message earlier, since I was the one who sent that out, that it would be coming from 1 Corinthians 12. It's actually coming from 1 Corinthians 11. That was a slip of my hand. So if you have your Bibles, either in physical or in digital form, and we'll have verses up here. If you would, please turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 11. And this might seem an odd place to go in talking about stories, because Paul doesn't really tell stories. Paul writes letters. He writes letters to churches. And Paul, by the way, even though he reads sometimes, and he is often read as a theologian writing stuff that somebody may read at some point. Yes, he is a theologian, but he is a theologian insofar as a minister is a theologian, because he is talking to people whom he's been in contact with. He's talking with people whom he's met, and with whom he has had dinner, and with whom he has shared not only meals, but also joys and challenges. He's talking to people that he knows and loves. And so when we come to this part, when he's talking about things that are going on in the life of the church, he's talking about things that he is perhaps not seeing himself as far as the issues that are going on, but he's talking to people whom he knows. The Corinthian church has a lot of problems. You might think that you've been in churches with problems. You might think this one has problems, but we've got nothing on the Corinthians. And one of their problems among many is the Lord's Supper. Paul says this, beginning in verse 17. Now, in the following instructions, I do not commend you. In other words, you are one fry short of a happy meal on this. Because when you come together, it is not for the better, but for the worse. When you gather on Sundays, it is not making things better for you, it's making them worse. Because to begin with, verse 18, when you come together as a church, I hear that there are divisions among you. And to some extent, I believe it. These are not just cliques. These are folks who think differently from one another and look at the other side and think, I'm not so sure about them. Verse 19, indeed, there have been factions among you. And he says this makes sense, for only so will it become clear who among you are genuine. Ooh, Paul, this is starting to hurt. Verse 20, when you come together, here's the deal, Paul says, it's not really for the Lord's Supper. For when the time comes to eat, each of you goes ahead with your own supper, and one goes hungry and another becomes drunk. And let's pause here for a second. picture this. Since the Lord's Supper at this time was not a single ritual out of the whole worship service in which you only take bread and only drink juice, or in this case wine, it's actually the full meal. And this love feast is sometimes called, is what the Lord's Supper looks like. And so as people commune with one another, they're eating a full-on meal, or at least some of them are. In fact, some of them are eating more than a full-on meal. They have not only brought the sumptuous food and drink from their much richer households, but they're also hoarding it. In some cases, some of them might be arriving a little bit earlier at the house of the one who's hosting church this week, kind of like in a bakery. They would rotate places, or they would have a single family that's well-to-do and has the space for it host these gatherings. And so some would come and arrive early, not just to visit, but also to start eating. And by the time some of the others who come in, who are getting off of work, or who are getting out of their labor job, or who are slaves and can't arrive until after dark, because that's when their masters allow them to come, they arrive, and the people who are there, who have the food and who have the drink, are not only full, but they have gorged themselves. Some even are drunk. And Paul's response to this is appropriate. Verse 22, what? Do you not have homes to eat and drink in? Can't you do that kind of thing at home, he says? Or do you show contempt for the church of God and humiliate those who have nothing? What should I say to you? Should I commend you? In this matter, I do not commend you. At this point, we might expect Paul to say, do this, and for goodness sake, do this. And he does say those things. He also says, do not do these things, these other things. But what Paul does then here in this next verse is that he points back to a story. Verse 23. I don't commend you for these things, and this is not the way in which you celebrate the Lord's Supper, because I received from the Lord what I also handed on to you. Here's the story. That the Lord Jesus, on the night when he was betrayed, or better translated, handed over, took a loaf of bread. And then when he had given thanks, he broke it, and he said, this is my body, that is for you. Do this in remembrance of me. In the same way, he took the cup also after supper, saying, this cup is the new covenant in my blood. Do this as often as you drink in remembrance of me. And this last part is crucial, because Paul is not just saying Jesus did this and so we should too. He says, for as often as you eat this bread and drink this cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes. Yes, it is that Jesus did this, but it is more than that. Anytime that you take of this bread, that you take of this cup, you are not only imitating Jesus, you are reenacting this story. The way in which you live your life, the way in which you do things in the world lives into a story. I grew up in a couple of different places, mostly in the country of the Philippines, as well as here in the United States. And when people ask me where I'm from, I often slightly freeze up just a moment and wonder, okay, how am I going to answer this now? And sometimes my answer will be one thing or another. But the bottom line there is that I cannot just give a piece of biographical data. Just a statement doesn't tell you about who I am. If you want to really know who I am, I have to tell you a story about the reasons why I lived in both places and why I I'm speaking to you in English, but I might also be thinking of another word that doesn't have a direct translation in English and have to think of or work around for it. I have to tell you why I am here standing in front of you, even though I was born on an island in the Philippines. To know who I am, I have to tell you a story. And I think that is in many ways the same case with Christian identity and the Christian practices that we have. And this next practice that we're going to go into, the sharing of the Lord's Supper, in order to make sense of it, in order to know who it is and who we are, we have to be in on the story. Paul gives this story, again, not just to show this is how you're supposed to be celebrating the Lord's Supper because Jesus did it this way. He says that it's rooted in Jesus's self-giving love. Perhaps he doesn't use those words. But if you know the story, you know what goes on. You know that Jesus gave up his life for those who were sitting at that table with him, one of whom betrayed him, handed him over. He was willing to do that out of love. How much more should it be with those who sit down at the table, those who share a brother and sisterhood, who share family in the family of God? How much more should that story affect and shape their lives? Several years ago, I watched the movie The Color Purple, starring Whoopi Goldberg. And in this movie, this woman who is this black woman in really post-slavery but still Jim Crow era United States is trying to make her way in the world. And what this looks like is a whole bunch of suffering at the hands of oppressive whites in her community and at the hands of oppressive black men in her community. And she has a sister who manages to escape this and actually goes off to Africa and makes a life there. And at one point in the movie, as the first woman is trying to make it through the day-to-day life, she receives a letter from her sister. And she reads it. And her sister starts telling her about Africa and about the things that are going on there. She starts telling stories about the children that she's raising there and about what she will do when she gets to come back to see her sister. And on a regular basis, the woman starts hearing, I believe her name is Sissy, but I'm not 100% sure. I did not check before this. Google will have that answer. You can check afterward. But Sissy starts getting these letters on a regular basis. And she starts reading them for dear life, if you will. And she says that as she's reading these stories, the things that are in those stories suddenly become more real than the things that are around her. The oppression, the slurs, the daily grind of trying to figure out what you're going to do to make it to the next day. Those things start to fade into the background, and it is these letters from her sister that starts giving life. These are the stories that end up shaping her life. What are the stories of the Bible, of the Christians that you've known, that you've encountered, the stories of your own experiences with God that shape who you are, that shape what you do, that shape what you come to the table with? And we are about to go into the Lord's Supper now. Let me invite you during this time and over the course of the week to ask yourself, what stories do you go to, and what stories are represented in the Lord's Supper? And what is the story that you are going to try to live in this about more this coming week? Like I said earlier, if you want to really know me, I have to tell you a story. What are the stories that you need to tell in order for others to know who you are as a Christian?